everybody to today's North Eastern Cumbria branch meeting. We'll just give it a few seconds just to allow for people to join us on this great day today. Hopefully you're all keeping extremely well and survived the storms at the weekend, which certainly for health and safety professionals was quite interesting when you watch some of the footage. So we'll just give a couple of minutes for everyone to join us today, and hopefully, I said, everybody's doing really, really well. So if you just give us a couple of minutes, we'll get underway. Okay, so today our meeting, we're going to be covering the topic of standardising net zero. Certainly from my point of view, I'm seeing an increasing amount of on pre-qualification questionnaires, on tenders and things of that nature, a lot more emphasis on what organisations are doing. So I'm really pleased to welcome Tama from iCore Systems, who will be presenting today. Also, very pleased to have Tama on our branch committee as well. So what you'll see is in the on your screen, you'll have a Q&A box. So if you do have any burning questions, please do. Tama's here to answer these for us. If you can actually place those into the Q&A box rather than the chat, that'll certainly help from my point of view, who will be asking Tama these questions at the end, to actually work our way through those. So please, it is an interactive session with regards to questions, and there will be time at the end of the session to do that. So without further ado, I will hand over to the safe hands of Tama to take us through net zero. So I'm really am very excited for this topic, definitely. So welcome, Tama, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jo. It's really good to be here, and welcome everyone. Thank you for volunteering to spend your lunch with me. Headline is we're going to be talking about methodologies and standardization for net zero. So kind of as we're learning more about net zero, how are we trying to make sense of it for organizations? My name is Tama Carroll. I am a senior environmental consultant based in the northeast of England, up in Newcastle. Although you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm not originally from the Northeast. In fact, I'm not even originally from this country. I was born and raised in South Africa, and that has a lot to do with why I am so passionate about the environment and about helping businesses protect the environment. iCore Systems is a cloud-based solution that allows businesses to make sense of environmental legislation. And at the moment, we're developing a health and safety module to help organizations navigate legislation. And the system's quite intelligent in that it allows you to audit yourselves against regulations. So tell us what your business does, and we'll be able to tell you what laws apply to it, and more importantly, how well you can demonstrate compliance against that legislation. Now, because I kind of work predominantly in the sphere of environmental regulation, that has been one of the key drivers for net zero, and kind of the obligations that are falling onto businesses to ultimately reduce their carbon footprints and help us achieve this target by 2050. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey of net zero, how we've got to where we are, and what the kind of short to medium term future might look like for organizations. Anybody who's ever sat in on one of my webinars before will know that I am extremely passionate about this, and as always, my agendas are extremely ambitious. So I've got a lot I'd love to share with you in a very short period of time. So I am going to keep up the pace and leave some time for questions at the end of it. As Jo said, please do pop those in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many of those as we possibly can in the session. Otherwise, we will follow up. I'd like to just talk about the regulatory landscape for net zero a little bit, so how we got to where we are. I'm then going to touch on some of the frameworks that exist that are helping organizations standardize the process and progress towards net zero, and then a couple of hints and tips at the end about how to ensure compliance to make sure that as regulation changes and other drivers change, you're able to proactively manage those changes and hopefully always be kind of one step ahead of the next thing to come, because net zero is not going anywhere. This is kind of the most pressing environmental issue for organizations to focus on at this point in time, as I say, in the short to medium term. So, a little bit of background. We're talking about net zero a lot. It is, I think every year there's like a new buzzword for, sustainability, environmental management. Net zero has become the predominant topic of conversation. It's how we are able to make sense of sustainability at an organizational level. And ultimately, it is around reducing our carbon emissions to reduce our contributions towards global warming, which ultimately cause climate change. And although the term net zero is, relatively new in common parlance, this journey towards tackling climate change is certainly not new. In fact, it goes back nearly 30, 40 years that we've understood that our organizational activities contributing to global warming, thus causing climate change, and that the solution requires a global effort, a joined up approach towards ultimately reducing those carbon emissions. The first international agreement to this degree was signed in 1987. That was the Montreal Protocol. And this specifically targeted those CFCs and F gases that we find in cooling products that we know cause immense damage to the ozone and therefore increase the risk of global warming. So it was this international agreement that ultimately brought in regulations that made us control our F gases. It's why a lot of you who operate facilities will have to do regular maintenance and leak checking, and why F gases are included so significantly within your carbon footprints as a significant impact towards global warming. From 1987, we then saw the Kyoto Protocol come in 2005. In fact, there'd been a few iterations before this, but this was actually the world's first legally binding climate treaty. So every country that signed up to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 and then in 2005 agreed that global efforts were required to tackle climate change, and each country was going to begin to review the regulatory system for their own kind of geographical boundaries to determine what they could do locally and how that was going to contribute to the bigger picture of climate action. At this point in 2005, targets were pretty low. So we were only saying we wanted to reduce emissions by an average of 5% below a 1990 threshold. However, it wasn't, although legally binding, it wasn't kind of compelling enough for countries, for governments to understand the progress that was necessary towards climate change. However, from that protocol, the UK decided to lead the charge, and we introduced the Climate Change Act in 2008, and this became the world's first legally binding commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a much more ambitious 80% lower than a 1990 level. And it put a lot of obligations on the government to regularly assess the risks of climate change to UK health, safety, environment, the economic system, and future progress, and how all of these things are intimately connected to each other. And then we saw the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement has definitely been the thing that changed everything. So this is possibly the most significant global climate agreement to date. Every country has now set emission reduction pledges. So pledges, slightly different to targets, but at least there's global commitment. The biggest thing that the Paris Agreement did was it determined a threshold that each country needed to not exceed. So ultimately, we know global warming is causing temperatures to rise globally, and the Paris Agreement put a threshold in of each country looking for a way to keep global warming below a 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold. 1.5 degrees centigrade being the best case scenario, with 2 degrees sitting swiftly behind that as the line in the sand that we absolutely do not want to cross. And through understanding how carbon emissions were contributing towards this global warming, and now understanding that we've got thresholds of 1.5 degrees that we are trying to not exceed, it has pushed through much more stringent regulation that ultimately takes these pledges down to reduction targets. And each country, and obviously I'm focusing more specifically on the UK, as that's where I work and that's where I'm delivering from, is now putting in the regulation to make sure that those thresholds are legally binding, that it becomes a legal commitment. Because of this, the government went and reviewed the Climate Change Act, and in 2019 put in the amendment that raised this idea of target net zero. So from 5% to 80%, now the Climate Change Act commits to 100% lower than the 1990 baseline, and the term net zero came into existence. Again, the UK seeking to lead the charge on this one and pushing it through the regulatory system a lot more quickly. However, this is a global effort, and a lot of countries, Europe especially, is not too far behind. And again, we're seeing some significant changes in other regulatory areas that are a consequence of this target net zero. In the UK, we can see lots that come through. So, bigger organizations would have come into scope for the streamlined and energy carbons reporting, the first regulation that required carbon footprints for big organizations to be publicly available. ESOS is continuously asking organizations to audit their energy, and there's some significant changes happening there. Climate change agreements are being reviewed, climate change levies are being reviewed, energy performance for buildings is being reviewed. So from this net zero target, we can see it coming through the whole regulatory system. It is going to affect all decisions that are required to consider environmental impact. Streamlined and energy carbon reporting, I mentioned, this is a biggie and quite significant. And again, we're seeing some conversations around how this is likely to change. This put an obligation on larger organizations to report their carbon footprint for scope 1 and scope 2 categories with their financial reports every year. So that gets submitted to HMRC and it gets published on Companies House. And it's had kind of two knock-on effects. Firstly, we've calculated our carbon footprint. Now the regulation is pushing through reduction targets. You've got your baseline. How are you going to do better? And secondly, this has put an obligation on large businesses, but that is ultimately pushing through the supply chain. So once bigger organizations are able to make sense of their carbon footprint and kind of how they are going to progress towards net zero, and natural consequences that eventually we have to start looking outside of our own organizations. And then it comes through to the medium, to the smaller businesses who are ultimately seeking to ensure that the supply chain is connected in terms of reporting, quantifying, and reducing carbon emissions. As I say, there's lots of chatter in the background about what this regulatory system looks like. It is what it is for the moment, but I would anticipate some significant changes over the next couple of years as that deadline for net zero gets ever closer. So we're aiming for net zero by 2050 as the headline. Now, the regulation's all coming through, and I've mentioned that it's touching all parts of the environment. We're seeing it filter through to health and safety regulation, planning regulation, permitting regulation, environmental regulation, and I would anticipate, kind of further, like I think it's got financial impacts and all sorts of stuff. But when we think about why it's trickling through everything, it comes back down to what the intention of the Paris Agreement was. So ultimately, the Paris Agreement called for us to dramatically reduce our carbon emissions so that we do not cause global warming to exceed a 1.5 degree centigrade threshold. And the practicalities of how we do that ultimately calls for an extreme transformation of production and consumption patterns. What we do know is that the current linear process in which we operate, where we take, make, and dispose, is inherently unsustainable. It also has a really significant environmental impact and carbon impact. And therefore, we need to think of the system as no longer linear, but actually circular. How do we reduce the pressure on the planet by not taking stuff we don't need? And once we do have materials, how do we ensure maximum value from those for as long as possible? So inherent to this theme of achieving net zero is also this idea of circularity, ensuring maximum resource efficiency and making sure that we are continuously striving towards this destination of sustainability, where people, planet, and profit are equal and equitable, and we are no longer degrading the environmental systems on which we depend. Now, the circular economy, again, is not a new concept. It has existed for a significant amount of time, decades, in fact, as we've always understood the impacts of our linear processes. But the principles of the circular economy are going to be what drives the regulatory changes we're going to see in the not too distant future. It is a broad term, and if you're not familiar with it, I would strongly recommend that you go and check out the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. It's kind of where it started. They pioneered the terminology and the language, and they also set off to define what circularity should achieve, how it should be done properly. And it's based on three really simple principles. I say simple conceptually, obviously a little bit harder in practice, but you can see these themes being pushed through the regulation. So the number one, or I suppose these aren't kind of weighted, they're not prioritized, they're all equally important. But the easiest intervention towards circularity is looking at every opportunity to eliminate waste and pollution. We need to stop throwing stuff away, especially when that stuff still has value that would be important for economic and social development. So the principle is we seek to eliminate waste and pollution. The second principle is that we ultimately seek to keep products and materials in circulation at their highest value. And that's the circularity. How do we keep something going and going and going so that we're not taking extra resources, we're not generating extra waste? And then the final element of circularity, which is not talked about a lot at the moment, but again, you can see some of the changes coming through the regulation, is ultimately this principle of helping nature to regenerate. Because the scientific perspective is reducing our carbon emissions is critical. A reduction today will make a significant difference, however small that reduction is. But even if all of us eliminated our carbon emissions by 100%, by 2030, ideally, it still wouldn't be enough to rebalance nature, to reduce the worst consequences of global warming and climate change. And the reason is that nature does it best. So ultimately, as we are striving towards net zero, we are looking for every opportunity to reduce our impact, to reduce our carbon emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, we should be looking for opportunities to regenerate nature, to strengthen the ecosystems that keep everything in balance. And those two kind of concerted efforts is what's going to progress us towards net zero, hopefully in time for the government targets. And again, from those key themes, you can see some of the changes in the regulation. So in 2021, we saw the Environment Act come in, and this is a foundational framework. There's still a lot that needs to be implemented as a result of this act. But just some of the headlines you can see here. Part 3 is about waste and resource efficiency. Part 5 is about protecting water. Part 6 is about nature and biodiversity. And Part 7 is about conservation. So those themes, reducing waste and pollution, keeping materials in use for the highest, longest amount of time, and regenerating nature is already foundationally implemented for the UK regulatory system. We just don't know exactly what all of this is going to look like yet. And that's kind of the fun and the curse of legislation. It's a constantly evolving science, it's a constantly evolving backdrop. We also saw something come in 2020 called the circular economy package. So the words that are used in these principles about, what net zero looks like is again drawing a direct line to the regulation. And the circular economy package caused a lot of changes to a lot of legislation that already exists. And again, some of those changes are still to come. So a lot of, what you can see on this list here, specifically around resources, products placed onto the market, packaging, waste, hazardous materials, that kind of stuff. All of those have been reviewed. A lot more responsibility in terms of producer responsibility. So anybody putting these products out onto the market, making them responsible for their safe disposal, which hopefully in turn will drive circularity. From a business perspective, there is kind of a foundational resource efficiency. We are buying stuff, we're using it, and then we're throwing it away. Is that the most efficient kind of use of things that are business critical, our financial resources, our time, effort, and energy? And there is a streamlining and circularity that could have, that triple bottom line benefit for people, planet, and for profit. Again, just to say, a lot of this is under review and under consultation. And what we do hope to see is that eventually all of these regulations will be more streamlined and the responsibilities on businesses will be clearer. But at the moment, it's a work in progress. Whilst it might seem overwhelming, there's a lot of reasons why progress towards net zero is necessary. The first and foremost is obviously the consequences of climate change. And as Joe mentioned, the storms over the weekend caused immense chaos for individuals, for communities, for businesses, and they're likely to increase. This is how the UK is going to be affected by climate change. We are going to see more storms. They're going to be more severe, and they're going to be more they'll happen more often, they'll happen more closely together. And all of that ultimately leads into the resiliency of organizations to navigate this ever-changing environment, this ever-changing climate. There are also really strong business drivers and commercial drivers for progress towards net zero. This report from the government came out last year. I think the picture I've shown you was a 2023 update. There have been more recent updates to that, but I find the conclusions from this report very encouraging. There is a good reason, there are lots of good reasons and opportunities within net zero. The first is that it is creating an era of change and opportunity. There are problems that need to be solved, and that will open up business opportunities for organizations. Sectors will come into existence that we've never seen before. Solutions will be designed and implemented that will help us move further along. The conclusion that the benefits of investing in net zero today will outweigh the costs in the long term. It is a way to unlock the ambition of places and communities. It will materially improve people's lives, both now and in 2050. And net zero ultimately remains the right target for the UK. It is backed by science, it is widely followed, and it is creating real opportunity. We're in this period of flux. We're figuring it all out. Things are not agreed, approved. Changes are happening left, right, and center. But from an organizational perspective, and definitely with the clients, the companies that I am working with, there is this kind of fundamental belief that we keep moving forward, because while everything's being figured out, there is enough science out there and there is enough research out there to tell us what the first steps towards net zero look like. And fundamentally, it comes back to those principles of circularity and how businesses should think about resources within their organizations. Now, obviously, That's all academia, that's all theory, these are all the principles that underpin net zero. But, you know, me, probably like most of you, like a little bit of standardization. You know, as an organization, that big question is, where do we begin? How do we begin to navigate this very complicated subject? So it comes down to standardized methodologies for net zero that are seeking to create some consistency in terms of how we all approach progress towards net zero. I think before I get into it, I do just want to spend a second unpacking some of the language that is used when we talk about these principles, these frameworks, and the regulation. Again, I do think sustainability people, we like some jargon, we like some lingo, and sometimes the words that we use are not immediately understood. They're not immediately obvious. The first thing is that we talk about carbon footprints as a way of measuring progress towards net zero. And it is important to understand, first and foremost, that a carbon footprint is not just your carbon. There are a number of greenhouse gases that cause global warming, which ultimately results in climate change. And the obligation on businesses when you do your carbon footprint is that you actually measure all of those greenhouse gases, of which carbon is a proportion, but it's not the only one. Now, there is a standard called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that helps you determine what greenhouse gases need to be measured within that carbon footprint. So technically, a carbon footprint and a greenhouse gas footprint are synonymous. Carbon footprints must include everything, and you'd be able to tell that by the unit of measurement, which is carbon dioxide equivalent. That little E on the end is really important because that tells us it's not just carbon, it's all greenhouse gases. For anybody, oh, I even put a slide in on it. So this was kind of the point I was making. Carbon dioxide accounts for 76% of our greenhouse gas emissions, but we have other gases like methane, nitrous oxide, the HFCs, the perfluorocarbons and sulfur hexafluoride, which all have global warming potential. And the thing is, they're not all equal. Like some of these gases are worse than others. For example, sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, which is a critical substance in electrical switchgear. It helps to cool it so our electrical infrastructure doesn't explode. That is 26,000 times more potent than carbon if it were to escape into the environment. So anybody who's ever worked with SF6 will know that the regulation says we have to keep that contained. It has to be in a closed unit. We do not allow it to escape into the environment. But all of these should be measured as part of an organizational carbon footprint. When you do your carbon footprinting, when you're looking at all of the greenhouse gases that you measure, the frameworks, the methodologies ask you to break it down into different categories. So I'm not going to delve into this too much right now, but you might hear people talking about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 categories in their carbon reports. And each of those refers to essentially a different part of the business, a different area of the organization. When we talk about scope 1 and scope 2, those are directly purchased fuels and electricity. So essentially, scope 1 and scope 2 gives us a really clear indication of the energy requirement of an organization or of a building or of a particular process. And it very much talks about the business's own activities that they have direct control over. And the legislation, the regulation, and a lot of the frameworks say to businesses, when you're doing your carbon footprint, the bare minimum, you must include scope 1 and scope 2 categories so that we can see some consistency. Now, scope 3 is everything that happens outside of an organization. And at the moment, there is very little consistency in terms of which categories from scope 3 should be reported. So all in all, there's 17 categories in scope 3, and each business at the moment is choosing, cherry picking which scope 3 categories it would like to report on. Fully encourage that, you know, dig into scope 3, find the opportunities that exist, record, measure, quantify whatever you can. But from a global perspective, it still means we can't compare one footprint with the other because we're not necessarily all measuring the same things at the moment. And there is still very much this perspective that scope 1 and scope 2 are mandatory, but scope 3 is voluntary. So we don't really have to do that. I'd like to argue against that. We definitely should be digging into scope 3. And again, in the conversations I'm having with my clients, there is an overarching awareness that whilst difficult and complicated, scope 3 is the area that we definitely need to be paying more attention to in terms of those opportunities for circularity and for engaging our supply chain, for making our supply chain more resilient and looking for opportunities to close the loop. So that's kind of the background in terms of what your product would be. You know, if you were to apply one of these methodologies towards net zero, the first thing you're going to do is do a carbon footprint, is set a baseline, understand all of your greenhouse gas emissions so that you can set targets to reduce them. Now, that's step 1, but the destination is net zero. And again, there are a lot of words around this subject that I think are making the landscape quite complicated and quite confusing. We are very much talking about net zero, and that net in net zero is critically important. When we talk about net zero, it's this state in which our emissions of greenhouse gases are balanced by removals. And the way that we remove greenhouse gas emissions is through nature regeneration, conservation, and biodiversity enhancement. So essentially, we're looking for a balance where we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, ideally 100%, and then we begin to compensate through that or balance that through removals, proactive removal from the environment. Now, that is different to carbon neutral. Carbon neutral is essentially offsetting or outsourcing. There's no specific requirement to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions if you claim that your products are carbon neutral. All that means is we know what our carbon footprint for this thing is, and we're going to go plant some forests to compensate, to offset, to outsource it. But we're not reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. There are some other terms that would ultimately be the longer term objective, and that is absolute zero or true zero, where we have literally zero greenhouse gas emissions. And absolute zero would ultimately lead to climate neutrality. And that's where we stop warming the planet. So lots of words are getting used. Some of them sound really fancy. Some of them sound really complicated. But I would like to just focus on net zero as the objective and its key difference to carbon neutrality, which is another, word that we see being used a lot out there. Picture helps, because I do think this is quite difficult. So where we are at the moment is we are emitting a lot of greenhouse gases and we are not reducing them and we are not removing them through nature-based solutions. And that's our current state. When we progress to net zero, we'd like to see this seesaw balance out, where our emissions do not exceed our removals and we get back to the lowest limit of greenhouse gas emissions possible. I think as altruistic as I'd like to be, true net zero, absolute net zero is not possible right now. Forgive the sun that has decided to come in and get me square in the eyes. So yes, understanding this, again, I think conceptually quite straightforward, in practice, challenging. We are figuring this out. So how do we get towards net zero? Well, the first kind of step would be to look at methodologies that exist that help us make sense of this, I'm a systems person. I build environmental management systems and always have done. So I like a framework that brings about consistency between organization A and organization B. There is a United Nations program called Race to Zero. And Race to Zero is kind of pioneering the steps that need to be taken by organizations to achieve net zero. What's brilliant is this is a global campaign. So this kind of science-based approach to what net zero looks like is being agreed at a global level. And then the systems, the frameworks, and the standards are coming out of that to give us all a little bit of consistency. The Race to Zero is a umbrella term, kind of the banner to which we can all hang our hats on and align with the organization if net zero is a strategic priority. Off the back of Race to Zero, we then saw the Science-Based Targets Initiative come in, and that is the popular methodology for the corporate sector, which allows us to understand exactly what it will take to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And there are other frameworks like Carbon 4 or industry-specific initiatives like Albert or Add Net Zero or specific ones for the construction sector or manufacturing sector. My number one point on this is they are all coming from Race to Zero. So Race to Zero, this global campaign, is setting the standardization for all of us. And every single framework that's being developed, whether it's the Science-Based Targets Initiative or whether it's an industry-specific one where industries are taking the principles and figuring out what it means to their specific sector, they are all fundamentally the same because they are all coming from this broad umbrella of what net zero means and how we achieve that through principles of circularity. The Race to Zero asks organizations, states, regions, investors, and individuals to jump on the bandwagon towards net zero. And to jump on the bandwagon, to begin to make progress towards net zero, there's kind of three first steps that you have to take. The first is that you make a promise, a public commitment to reach net zero as soon as possible, with the initial front-loaded reduction target of 50% by 2030. So as a starting point, if you are doing your carbon footprints and you're trying to understand how to get there, your first target is an absolute reduction of 50% by 2030. And again, if you are signed up to any other frameworks like B Corp or Business Declares or Pledge to Zero, they are all working on the same principles. In order to have a credible net zero strategy, there are 6 key criteria. The first is that promise to reduce as much as possible, as quickly as possible. That is 50% by 2030 and 90% by 2050. Those are your 2 key targets, and then you can work out what the space in between looks like. They ask to be very cautious with removals and offsets. So you cannot offset without reducing. That will not achieve net zero. So again, be careful about how you communicate progress towards net zero. If you do not have reduction targets, if it's only offsetting, then you're not doing net zero. You're not moving towards it. It has to be both reduce, remove, and regenerate nature. It also says that you shouldn't look at carbon in isolation. You should think about the whole picture of sustainability. You should be transparent and open with your progress to date. So how do those targets look? What's your plan for the space in between? And there should be a detailed strategy, what they call a decarbonization plan, to validate it. So once you've got your data, you'll understand where the opportunities for reduction might be. But in order to credibly say we are progressing towards net zero, every single framework says all 6 of these criteria have to be met. And the one that I see businesses struggling with the most is around offsetting versus reduction. So it's really, really important to understand that for your own organization. Using something like the greenhouse gas protocol, which again has existed for nearly 30 years, this is the methodology that tells you how you calculate your carbon footprint. And what the new frameworks, science-based targets and race to zero, are specifically saying is that unless you include scope 3 categories completely within your carbon footprint, you again cannot specifically say you're progressing towards net zero. If you're not measuring the whole picture, how can we wholly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? So again, just be careful. If you've only measured scope 1 and scope 2, that is not a commitment towards net zero. Scope 3 categories must be included. Science-based targets say where more than 40% of your footprint sits in scope 3, it must be included. Race to Zero says anything that is materially relevant in scope 3 must be included. Science-based targets is kind of driving this. This is very much around what it would take to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold. And again, it is a global initiative with all of the key players involved in the conversation about what net zero looks like. So aligning with these frameworks, aligning with these standards means that we've got all of the right people feeding into what progress towards net zero would actually look like. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm just going to touch on this last little bit. It is about understanding science-based targets. So again, it's helping us achieve the Paris Agreement to stay below that 1.5 degree centigrade threshold. And the targets at the moment are very clear. 30% reduction, 50% reduction by 2030, 90% reduction by 2050 with regeneration and proactive removal of greenhouse gas emissions. The process to do it, so to align with the methodology for science-based targets, cover all of your greenhouse gases, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, set very specific timelines, minimum of 5 years, maximum of 15 years. Make sure your objective is that we stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade. Scope 3 absolutely must be included, and the organization must publicly disclose their carbon footprint and progress towards net zero. To get involved, you commit, so it's a public promise, again, to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, put in your emission reduction targets, submit your evidence, communicate to your stakeholders, and continue to report. It's essentially the same things. Make a promise, understand your targets, have a plan in place, and be open and transparent with your progress towards net zero. You'll be pleased to know Science-Based Targets Initiative does have a framework. There's a net zero standard that includes guidance, criteria, and recommendations for companies to align with science-based targets. And the kind of background to this is in terms of risk management for organizations. So being quite clear in terms of be very careful about when you promise net zero and what that process looks like. And the general consensus amongst the governmental, academic, and scientific community is that the process of standardization with science-based targets is the best weapon organizations have against greenwashing. It means that when you make your commitments towards net zero, you have a credible methodology backing up what you've done so far and how you plan to get there. There's quite a few guidance documents around this on net zero. So how to get started, looking at the corporate standard. There's a different standard for larger organizations, slightly more complicated greenhouse gas inventories. And they also have an online tool so you can begin to measure your carbon footprint, and it will support you in establishing what those kind of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 reduction targets might look like between now and 2050. Your decarbonisation plan, again, the standards are very prescriptive, really, in what this looks like, but it's not anything we're not used to. So if you worked with any kind of standard, your plan should be smart. It should be very specific. And because net zero is a long-term strategy, it's a long-term journey, you should be thinking about those short, medium, and longer-term objectives. When we start looking at the medium to longer term objectives, there is some uncertainty. We're waiting for regulation to change. We're talking 10, 15 years from now. Science is going to change. New technologies are going to come in to help us solve these problems. So I think my conclusion on this might seem quite overwhelming, but we are encouraged to break it up. So in the short term, between now and 2030, which is your first reduction target of 50%, what are your clear delivery dates and responsibilities? How do we control the next 5 years? And whatever we learn through that will help us do the 5 years after that and the 5 years after that as we continue to evolve. How we do greenhouse gas reduction, I'm sure you've seen this all before. This is a management hierarchy. We've seen it for waste. We've seen it for chemicals. We've seen it for risk. We're trying to create circularity. So we're looking to eliminate greenhouse gases wherever we can. If we can't eliminate, can we reduce or substitute for less harmful emissions? And only when we get to the very bottom, when we've eliminated, reduced, and substituted as much as we can, and it says keep going, you shouldn't even be looking at compensation within the first 5 years. Eliminate, eliminate, eliminate. And only when you get to the bottom of the barrel and you literally can't do any more, then we look at compensation or offsetting or regeneration as a part of our decarbonisation plan. There's also the Carbon Disclosure Project. You guys might have come across that before. Again, I'm seeing this being asked for in PQQs and tenders, which is quite new. Again, same framework, based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, underpinned by science-based targets and the science-based initiative, and overarchingly aligning with the race to zero. So based on your sector, based on your business, you might decide that the Carbon Disclosure Project would be appropriate for you. Typically bigger businesses, but as I say, I'm seeing that come through the supply chain. And you might also come across the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This used to be very financial, again, not new. It's existed for a long time. It's about the investment risk for organizations based on climate change and those kind of competing factors. But again, same framework, same people at the table, same principles in terms of progress towards net zero. Focus is very much on governance, strategy, risk management, and then the measurement of those targets. Last little point I'd like to make on this is about avoiding greenwashing and making better environmental communication. Net zero is complicated. A lot of people are trying to figure out what it means, how to apply it, and this is opening up immense risk for businesses that we inadvertently make a commitment that we cannot deliver or that we cannot validate. We don't have the system in the background to help us achieve that. So alongside progress towards net zero, there is also a lot of standardization now in terms of how we communicate that progress. There's a few UK and international standards and guidance, so responsible marketing, the ICC framework, there's an ISO an ISO standard, and then there's also the Competition and Marketing Authority guidance. Ultimately, what it says is we have to be transparent, truthful, and accurate. We have to be clear and unambiguous. We can't omit or hide important information, which is a very significant thing for those scope 3 categories. We have to make fair and meaningful comparisons. We have to be able to validate what we're saying. And again, we must consider the full life cycle of products and services. Every single guidance document ultimately comes to these 6 criteria, and we can see that being implemented in the UK through the marketing guidelines, which incidentally are under consultation to be converted into regulation. So greenwashing or miscommunicating about our environmental performance is likely not only to be risky for businesses in the future, but likely to be illegal for businesses in the future. Although the argument is it always has been illegal, we have to tell the truth about our products and services. My conclusion is that net zero and carbon neutral are not the same, and this is the biggest risk I see for businesses at the moment. When we talk about net zero, the methodologies and the standardization is very clear. We are looking at net zero before 2050. There are multiple standards and approaches and criteria that tell us how to do it. It tells you what you have to measure out of those scope 1, 2, and 3 categories. It is based on the ambitions of the Paris Agreement to align that 1.5-degree goal. And it says when you've removed as much as you can, cautiously look at carbon removals, but offsets are not allowed. A lot of businesses are claiming carbon neutrality at the moment. Again, the conversation is that that term is going to be pulled. Businesses shouldn't be able to claim it because it's not as rigorous, it's not as standardized, and it doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't require reduction. It's just outsourcing. It's just offsetting. So please be very cautious with that. I think that seems a good place to stop. My final say is if the world of environmental regulation and all of these standards and frameworks is a little bit overwhelming, I understand. I sympathize, empathize with that. But if you've got any questions, I would be more than happy to support you beyond this. So thank you very much. That was a lot.
Thank you so much, Tama, and how you can fit all of this. It's one of these we probably could carry on talking for the next few hours in all honesty, because it's such a hot topic. Definitely, it's a very daunting topic, and you certainly have demystified some of those terms in that language used. It does feel a little bit like the curtain's just been pulled back in the Wizard of Oz, and we can now actually see the wizard behind it, certainly for me anyway.
Yeah.
Excellent point on is like the net zero. Can't just have that offsetting. We have to really get everything hand in hand with that reduction. And I must admit, your last few slides hit very much at home with me, because the frustration I certainly see, whether it's not necessarily my clients, but out there in the industry, that many people don't take that approach. Let's get the hierarchy of control in place first. Certainly by, we should be doing that first step of just don't do it in the first place. And I do have them shout out TV and radio when I hear a lot on offsetting and, buying carbon credits and things of that nature. If we didn't do it in the first place, we wouldn't have to be worrying about that. So certainly those last few slides are an area that I'm definitely get very frustrated with when I see certainly certain things being reported. We've had a few questions come in, and so let me just start with one, which relates to the oil and gas industry. So we have the question of, in the oil and gas industry, we not just report on scope 1s and 2s, but also along the processes and commercial chain that comes in with like biofuel aviation. What would your advice be for a single platform solution, if there is one, to combine all those calculations and able to accurately produce that reduction amount for corporate reporting?
I wish there was a single platform. My feeling is like this is one of the opportunities, there is kind of a commercial opportunity for someone to come and solve this problem. A single platform would definitely be beneficial for all of us, because I think one of the limitations is you do your carbon footprint, and businesses exist in isolation. And then the next question is like, is it good? Are we doing better than our competitors? Like, how do we compete against other businesses in the same sector, industry, geographical location, and that kind of stuff? Unfortunately, I'm not aware of a one-stop shop at the moment, but what I would recommend is that definitely you should be looking at software opportunities to kind of keep it clean, keep it standardized, ensure your data rigor. But when you're choosing, kind of this provider or this platform, you are able to ask questions about, are you aligned with the principles of the race to zero? Are you integrating science-based targets into the platform to help me determine my, reduction targets? So I think It's about looking for something that gives you more. You know, there's lots of calculators out there. You put your numbers in, you get a carbon footprint out the background, but there's more towards net zero. So kind of, you know, looking for organizations that are going to meet that need. I'm sorry, I
Yeah,
can't be more specific. I wish there
yeah.
was.
It's yeah, unfortunately there isn't one size fits all, and with the different industries that we all work in, there's different things that will have an influence. I suppose then moving a little bit more with that sort of that data, as more and more information becomes available from the supply chain. I know certainly for myself when I've tried to find out what I would think was a simple thing. You know, what's my carbon footprint for a pair of gloves or safety boots or whatever it might be? And when I've certainly gone out to the supply chains, it's we can't tell you, but we can tell you this new sustainable item we've now manufactured, but they can't
Yeah,
tell me of what's really out there and what people are using. But of course, as we're getting improved data collection, if I'm looking at my scope one, twos, and threes, suddenly my values are going to jump up. So even though maybe I've not increased my turnover, I've not
yeah,
done anything different, all it is the data available to me is better. How can a
absolutely.
company deal with that sudden jump maybe in reporting because they've now got more to report on?
Yeah. So it's not a perfect science, it's not a perfect system. It will be a shock though, you know, once you bring in those scope 3 categories, you know, it's obvious, of course, your whole footprint is going to go up. What the greenhouse gas protocol tells you to do is that once you get, you know, a figure that is the truest, most accurate representation of your business, then that should be your new baseline. So if you did your footprint 10 years ago, you know, and you only did scope 1 and scope 2, and that's the baseline that you've been measuring against, but this year we have an objective that we're going to bring scope 3, your baseline becomes redundant. It's not comparable. So this now, with all those scope 3 categories, will be the truest, most accurate version. And then we measure performance against that. It seems confusing, you know, because almost the benchmark changes from 10 years to now, but it's about that accuracy. One little point I'd like to make to what you just mentioned as well, but the carbon footprint of products. We've seen new regulations come in Europe, and they are going to be implemented in the UK. So they'll be in Europe this year, 2026 for the UK. And it's a little piece of legislation called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Still figuring out exactly what that all means, but essentially now every product that gets imported or exported from Europe and eventually imported or exported from the UK will have to have a product footprint. So not only what is the item cost, the tax cost, and the carbon cost of each product. And it's going to be difficult. It's going to be messy for all of us to navigate. But again, progress towards net zero until we are measuring everything properly is going to be very hard to quantify. So if you do work in a product-based business, I'd say do a little bit of research around this. It's going to be significant. As with everything, get ahead on your data as quickly as possible.
And I suppose for many businesses, they're certainly with people I've been speaking with, you know, if they're working for very large organisations, they could be just a very small SME, that suddenly they're being asked for lots of information that's important for that large organisation. They've got to be doing that reporting. But for the SME, it's very, very challenging with maybe a team of one. Very often it turns to the occupational health and safety professional to be the person that the topic gets given to without any experience and any knowledge.
Yeah.
So it can be quite a minefield, I would say, but and many people jump maybe too quickly into to putting out a report rather than actually getting all of that data in a good amount to get that benchmarking in there, because you're getting that pressure from certainly from your clients to give that information to them. So
Absolutely.
yeah, very, very challenging. Unfortunately, and I would love to stay on for the rest of the afternoon, and hopefully um, everybody else would do also, but we are coming to, unfortunately, the end of our allocated time. So I'd really, on behalf of everybody, you know, on this meeting today, thank you so much, Tama, as always, for a fantastic presentation. full of lots of information, guidance, and very, very thought-provoking. So I do really appreciate your time today to share that with us. Um,
Thank you.
Before we close the meeting, I just want to remind any IIRSM members, please do log into your My IIRSM account. Just make sure your details are updated, because one little change that you'll see, a new feature, is when you log in, you do actually have an option to set your primary and secondary branch. So it's just a new feature that you'll sort of see. So I'd like to thank everybody. We have got another meeting scheduled for next month, which is covering contractor control, which you will be receiving emails and updates on IIRSM on the events page. Any questions we've not been able to answer, we will try our best to get that back to everybody. And today's session has been recorded. For those that are members of IIRSM, you'll actually find it available via the website. So thank you again to everybody. Really appreciate your time, and very much thank you to Tamara also. So from the branch, I wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.